So thank you very much for the invitation, Mayor and Kerry. I'm thrilled to be able to talk to people out in Western states. And although my talk today, you'll hear me use the state that I reside in, that's Arizona, as a sort of cautionary tale to everybody, what we are experiencing globally as far as climate change is concerned and the effects on the pest prevalence in everywhere. It is changing. It's a very changing dynamic landscape. And even in the 25 years that I've resided in Arizona off and on, I've seen some significant changes, and I'm sure that everybody else can relate. So it's a grand title there, Climate, COVID, and Crowding, Public Health Pests Affecting Human Health, Business, and Livability. And I'm just going to try to take the next 59 minutes to really convince you that it is that important and that significant, what's happening as a result of climate change where we live, work, and play. There's significant room for improvement when it comes to urban planning. And that beautiful picture right there is a very complimentary image of the Phoenix metro area. It is this gigantic city upon city upon city that sprawls out into the desert, and it's ever expanding, and home to nearly 5, I think it is, million people at this point, or over 4 million at least. So the urban planning of each of those different cities that forms this huge conglomerate of urbanization, really it's a patchwork effort, of course, because everybody has slightly different rules and regulations. But as far as the pests that reside within, they don't necessarily have to stick to city limits, of course. And so the policies that are enacted within the different municipalities, the impacts of those get to be shared by everybody who lives there, essentially. So urban planning is making an increasing impact on the pest prevalence and those wherever you are in the US and elsewhere too. This is going to be a plea that with every action that we take to mitigate the effects of climate change where we're living, that we keep in mind that there are multiple effects on a biological system and the ecosystem that we live in. Sometimes we make decisions to create cool corridors in hot spots in a city that then generate more opportunities for mosquitoes to be more prevalent in, for example. I'm going to give you some examples of those. Now, whether you're in the northern states and you have different pushes and pulls on your climate and different trends, or in the southern area of the West where I'm at, you'll be able to relate to some of the trends that we talk about throughout today. So first of all, just a absolute understatement, climate change effects are ecologically complex. They are phenomenally complex. In any given environment, any ecosystem, the outcomes can be remarkably unpredictable. And that is because quite often that we tend to focus in on what we're familiar with, and there are many, many different impacts that changes within any particular ecosystem affect many different biological organisms. So keep that in mind, because some of the states on some of you on this call today are going to be in the northwestern states, or in the north of Arizona at least. The Global Climate Change Group that aggregates data and develops trends as far as climate's concerned releases updates regularly, but the northwestern states are considered to be seeing significant changes in the timing of stream flow, increasing wildfires, increasing insect outbreaks, both agricultural and non-agricultural, sea level rises, erosion, inundation, ocean acidity changes, tree disease issues, and die-off have been generally increasing. Declining water supplies, and that is also a significant pressure in the southwestern states where I'm at, where we have a water crisis. Other parts of the country are having some of the opposite effects, in that they're getting too much water, where they're less able to deal with those trends because they have an infrastructure that is built, not built with those capacities in mind. So just looking at the differences for a second between climate and weather. When we talk about the weather, it's whether it's hot outside, whether it's cold outside, whether it's raining or not, and we're talking about the here and now. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about very, very long periods of time, and the overall average changes in conditions, in those environmental conditions, over long hundreds of years, not this year versus last year. And what I will talk a little bit about today and share are some of the things and some of those variances that we've seen as a result of both climate changes and extreme weather events, where we have super hot years or super cold years or super wet years. So keep those two things separate in your mind. Climate change are those effects over a long period of time and those trends, whereas the weather is just what happens for this year or this week or for right now. So climate change effects, you'll see that there's a list of cities on the left side of this slide, and these are the cities that are in those top 10 of the fastest warming cities in the US. And you can get online and you can Google the fastest warming cities in the world or in your region. There's lots of information for you to mine out there. This is just a snapshot of how those temperatures, the average temperatures, have changed since the 1970s. And you can see an awful lot of those cities are in the West, which is interesting. And our trends in the Southwest are warmer and drier and very similar to the trends in the Northwest as well. So the state I'm in, we have two of those cities listed as in those hottest, fastest, the most rapidly warming cities. So again, I'm going to use Arizona and the Phoenix metro area as a precautionary tale for us all to learn from. This is actually a graph that I crunched the data from using NOAA data, and I had to fill in gaps. So there's some sort of frog DNA in there. If you're a Jurassic Park fan, you'll know what that means. But suffice to say, it's pretty convincing that we're in a warming trend long time. So both long-term climate change and weather conditions influence the vector-borne diseases in a location pretty significantly. Now, vector-borne diseases are those diseases caused by pathogens that are transmitted by mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, so arthropods, insects and ticks primarily are the two big ones for most of the US, although depending where you live, fleas also can be an issue. So in any long-term trend or even year by year, there are always winners and losers. And we even see this if in state, wherever you are, if you have a particularly wet year or a particularly dry year, you can have blooms of one particular kind of bug and others can be just sort of completely missing in action. And generally speaking, those populations recover if those fluctuations are cyclical in the short term, but over long periods of time, then you start getting some significant changes in the biological flora and fauna in your state. Now, as a public health entomologist dealing with all of those things that bite and sting for that matter, but we're really going to talk about the biters more today, we see that relatively small increases in temperature can have some pretty unfortunate effects on those vectors that are key for disease vectoring in our states. Increases in the rate of reproduction of those vectors, increases in the replication of pathogens being carried in those vectors, increasing infection rates. So a higher proportion of ticks will carry a pathogen, and then even infection rates of hosts. So the primary hosts for West Nile virus, for example, are birds, and you'll get a larger proportion of your crows or a larger proportion of your sparrows or house finches that are carrying the West Nile virus in their system and amplifying it in the process. So as a general rule, increases in temperature within extremes, obviously, is bad when it comes to vector-borne diseases because of those things. So climate-sensitive species of all kinds tend to change their spatial distributions. We find interesting species cropping up in places they didn't used to be, and then similarly, species disappearing in places where they used to be. There'll be seasonal cycles that differ. A lot of our vector populations, whether they're ticks or mosquitoes, have multiple generations in any one year. And if you have 10 life cycles going on in over a year rather than 3, because you have longer summer months or a longer summer or a longer length of the warm season, I should say, then that is generally bad when it comes to vector-borne diseases because of the higher prevalence and the longer period of time that they're around. Survival over winter is incredibly influential in the disease level. So right at the beginning of vector seasons. So if you have a very mild winter and those mosquitoes just do not get subject to cold freezes and hard freezes, you can start off in your spring with just huge blooms, whereas normally if you have a nice freeze and some regular cold snaps over the winter period, you can have much lower populations that get going slower. And also, of course, the host-seeking activity is impacted quite dramatically as well by temperature and humidity levels. So this is just one example I wanted to give you that we had issues within Arizona. We had the very, this is like a supermodel of the ticks in the tick world. This is a good looking tick. Ticks are pretty nasty looking creatures, if you ask me. But this is the Gulf Coast tick, which is probably like the Angelina Jolie of ticks. And we started finding them in Arizona for a few years. And in fact, we had 9 human cases of Rickettsia parkeri, which is a spotted fever, and that's transmitted by these ticks, and the ticks were being shown up. Now, the Gulf Coast ticks, you can see on the map there, should be way over to the far east and south of the country and nowhere near Arizona. And then in the last couple of years, we have been monitoring for this tick and haven't been able to find it. So here's just a map of where we found the tick. Those little pluses are where we found the Gulf Coast tick. And then since 2019, haven't shown up. So we can find vectors in places that we didn't used to find them. And of course, the pathogens that they bring. We've also, in relatively recent years, experienced not only airborne pathogens that are new to us, but also vectored disease-causing pathogens that are new to us. And so I wanted to tell you, because West Nile virus is our main domestic vectored disease that impacts human health, I wanted to tell you a little bit about West Nile virus. So dating back to 1937, there was the first human case that was documented in the West Nile district of Uganda. You can see that way down there in that red dot in Uganda. And over the following sort of few decades, crows and doves in the Nile Delta, right up there, just north of, right by Cairo and Israel, and you can see the northernmost red dot on the map there. The virus had migrated in birds all the way up to the north of Africa, right there. 1997, there was a highly virulent, highly pathogenic to birds strain that was cycling in Israel and parts of Egypt there, and causing some significant die-off of birds in the area. So in 1999, strains of the highly pathogenic to birds virus started showing up in the New York area. And over the next few years, that virus started showing up across various parts of the US. It was detected in Arizona in 2003 and up in Washington a couple of years later. I want to say it was 2013. Sorry, it might have been a little late. It might have been 2015, but it took a while to move across the country, but it got to every state in the continental US eventually. And it's now the leading cause of domestically acquired arboviral disease in the continental US. So brand spanking new in 1999, now our leading cause of arboviral disease that claims lives every single year in the US. So it wasn't the first one to be introduced, won't be the last. It's just the biggest one that impacts us currently. The primary vectors are Culex pipiens, which is probably what most of you have on the webinar this morning. If you're in Arizona and watching, then it'll be Culex quincofasciatus, the southern house mosquito. And there's also Culex tarsalis, which is found in many Western states as well. Now, the Culex pipiens and the Culex quincofasciatus don't fly too far. The Culex tarsalis can fly long distances, far more than 5 miles from where they emerge, from where their developmental sites. The larvae of Culex tend to develop in natural or man-made swamps where there's high organic level content, and they really love that high organic content, and they don't have to have permanent water. It can be semi-permanent, and they are nighttime biters. So sunset, sunrise, as soon as that sun starts going down, they will start feeding. It does not have to be dark by any means. So here's what the natural cycle of West Nile looks like. They're primarily, this is a bird virus. So the birds amplify that virus. The viruses build up in, the virions build up in number inside these little avian creatures, and mosquitoes that feed on the birds will collect those viruses and feed on another bird later on, and then that bird can become infected with the virus as well. So every now and then those mosquitoes will bite something that isn't a bird, whether it's a horse or a person or any other warm-blooded creature, those or even amphibians for that matter. But warm-blooded creatures primarily are those that the mammals, many mammal species can actually be affected by the virus, but they're dead end hosts. So it's just the cycle is continued by the birds and the mosquitoes, but people can acquire the virus. It doesn't build up in high numbers in us, so other mosquitoes can't acquire it from us. And people do not transfer that virus from person to person. But we can get sick from the virus once we have it. So this just says what I just said. The arbovirus is maintained between mosquitoes and those numerous hosts that are really good at amplifying the virus, and those are birds. So when from an epidemiological perspective, West Nile has always been very unpredictable. It is and that's because it's, when you think about mosquitoes, even if you think that they're flying, within 5 miles of where they've developed, that means that the weather and the environmental conditions in a relatively local place are what's going to affect how prevalent those mosquitoes are and how prevalent the actual, whether there are lots of birds available. And of course, both of those two things are going to affect how much virus starts churning within the mosquitoes and birds in a given area. So weather and standing water, and whether there's susceptible host populations and mosquitoes in abundance, all affect the disease levels and disease incidence on a very local level. So some important things about West Nile virus: only 1 in 5 people will actually be symptomatic. So the vast majority of people who acquire the virus don't even know that they have it. They're asymptomatic. So they've been bitten by an infected mosquito, they just don't get sick. Most common symptoms are relatively mild, usually for the majority of cases, and severe forms of West Nile affect less than 1% of people who develop clinical symptoms, and about 10% of those people have a fatal illness, unfortunately. So in Arizona, about half of this state falls into the low hot elevation level, where there's relatively little rain. We've got a desert biome, an arid desert biome. So you would think that half of the state would be a pretty hostile place for mosquitoes to live in. And most of the people in the state that I'm in live in Maricopa County, which is at low level of elevation. So what this means is that you would think that most of the people wouldn't be terribly affected, but unfortunately that is not the case. So for us in Arizona, the key vector is the southern house mosquito, the important thing being there, the house part. And even the Culex pipiens love to be around buildings. And so if you're in the northern states, you're still going to be affected by a similar mosquito, looks very similar. And they like to live around us, whether you're in the north or the south. So why is the low desert so horribly plagued by West Nile virus? And that's because we do a lot of things in our landscapes to generate mosquito habitat quite deliberately. And so this is a beautiful area, 1,500 acres of mosquito feeding trails, 18 miles of trails that you can hike and bike and feed mosquitoes while you're doing it in this Phoenix metro area. So now, I'm being facetious, of course, it is a beautiful recreational area. The problem is, of course, whenever you put in lots of water in a very warm environment, yes, you manage to reduce that heat island effect that's associated with big areas of built environment. But you have to understand that that then generates the necessity for significant monitoring and very, very, very careful management of mosquitoes in those environments. Similar endeavor was undertaken right through a central corridor of Tempe, where the ASU students go to class. And so this is Tempe Town Lake, very beautiful picture right there. That's what the overflow area looks like. That habitat is absolutely mosquito central, perfect for generating lots and lots and lots of blood feeding mosquitoes. And so sort of a less idyllic look at that, what that does. And you can see that overflow area and the very green sort of bushy area at the far end of that lake. So that's very swampy. And then right in the middle of sort of cities, we have high concentration animal rearing facilities and irrigation ditches and wastewater treatment plants and all of those other places where we have just tons and tons of mosquito development sites. And again, this is part of the Phoenix metro area. If you are familiar with the area, you'll see that lakes in landscapes and ponds and water features are really, really popular. And they're really, really popular because, again, they help to reduce the heat island effect and help to make those super hot areas of the desert more livable. From the one perspective, but from my perspective, this is just an absolute mosquito utopia. And even if you aren't living in a landscape where there's extensive purpose-built lakes, and you just have retention areas, those retention areas you can see on the far right there, those are dry wells that have got blocked and they're full of water, and there's gazillions of mosquitoes churning out of those areas. So if there's no rain, there's no problem if you're a mosquito in landscapes that have lots and lots of water. Now you might look at that lower right picture there and go, oh no, that's highly manicured, look at that. There's no way there's going to be mosquitoes around there, right? Yeah, no, there's plenty of mosquitoes. So people love these water features. You can see a mosquito monitoring trap next to a fountain there. And then you can see this beautiful, well-maintained pool. And if people run those fountains and waterfall features, then all well and good. But if they are allowed to stand for any length of time, they hold water in water vaults. And you can see a bunch of students and a postdoc here pulling out lots of wriggling mosquito larvae from a water vault that was a waterfall feature in well-maintained pool, but it was still generating tons and tons of mosquitoes. So here's where I really come down hard on the urban planning people. These are just silly examples of just terrible, I don't know who. So these are dry features that are supposed to promote drainage, and the dry well there on the right in particular is never dry because it's right in the middle of a postage-sized piece of turf, which is irrigated twice a day for all of the year. So constantly holds water, constantly generates mosquitoes. And then even in those storm drain areas and retention ponds, they get blocked very, very quickly, and you end up with this subterranean lake that sometimes is evident and in the form of these swampy areas. and sometimes you can't see it at all. Sometimes you just have a lake where there was a huge area of turf, and it doesn't go anywhere for several weeks at a time after a rain event. So with all of those wonderful opportunities to generate high populations of mosquitoes in urban landscapes, we end up trying to talk people into doing a laundry list of things that they don't want to do in order to avoid getting West Nile virus. So just to give you an idea, so, these mosquitoes come out when the sun goes down, so don't go out when the sun goes down. But if you are in a hot area of the country, that is when you go out. We try to get people to cover up. If it is 116 degrees, you are definitely not going to be wearing a long sleeve jacket and pants and hoodie and everything else. Insect repellents, some people will wear them routinely, many won't. Removing standing water around the home to reduce those developmental sites is a grand idea. Not everybody can do it. Sleeping under mosquito bed nets is considered a bit extreme, and generally people won't do that. And then staying inside, people will occasionally do if they're so inclined. So some disease incidence maps for you, and you can identify where you are pretty easily on these maps. These are the CDC maps, and this was one that was generated for 2018, where we saw a sudden increase in the neuroinvasive form of West Nile fever. So that is the more severe form, and just like everybody's now familiar with COVID-19 and the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which has many different variants and strains, some of which are more impactful than others. This is just another virus with exactly the same sort of habits, in that there are different strains. Some are more pathogenic than others, and some are more impactful and inclined to cause neuroinvasive disease. So 2019, you'll see that the incidence of neuroinvasive disease changes a little bit. And so year to year, you will see these, the states that have a higher incidence change with the conditions within. So this is a map. The important part to this graphic is just that. So just look at those line of red stars. So this is Phoenix temperatures in the year 2020. We had lots and lots and lots of extremely hot days. In fact, we had 130 days of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. July was the hottest month ever on record. We had 14 days of over 115 degrees. That is too hot, even for mosquitoes. And we had relatively few cases of West Nile, relatively few neuroinvasive cases, and only 2 fatalities. Typical for Arizona is between 10 and 20 fatalities a year. You can get online to find your own state stats to know, and it is good to know what is average and what is not. 2021, again, just look at those. We had relatively few super high, extremely hot days in 2022. And there were significant differences in the amount of rain that Phoenix received between the years 2020 and 2021. So in 2021, we had we had fewer extreme hot days, and we had more consistent rain throughout the year. So unfortunately, what that does, oops, I think we jumped one. You can see we just went from, we had one of the wettest monsoons in many parts of the state for many years in 2021. So in fact, you can pull up these, the climate group maps that will show you pretty clearly where you're at as far as are you getting more rain or less rain at a particular time relative to previous years. And so you can see that we had lots more rain than we would normally have, 2 to 3 times the average rainfall in that Phoenix metro area and other parts of the state as well. And we had we just had plumes and blooms of insects, as did other parts of the US. And this is a bag, this was a mosquito trap that mosquitoes no more could actually fit in the trap. Sadly, the result of this. So the result of this was that we had 1,693 human cases of West Nile virus, though these are clinical cases, most of which were in Maricopa County. Most of the people live there. Also, 121 people lost their lives. That was the most deadly year for West Nile in Arizona history. And it's largely attributed to higher rainfall and cooler temperatures. But there's an awful lot that we could have done and should have been able to do to not allow that to happen. There were other things that happened in that year other than cooler temperatures and higher rainfall. It happened to be the year where there was a policy change at the county health level, making the homeowners associations responsible for mosquito management in their HOAs. So prior to that, a lot of larviciding occurred in those neighborhoods, whether they were HOA neighborhoods or not. And then all of a sudden, over 5,500 HOAs suddenly had to be responsible for doing their own larviciding. Probably not a good idea, and definitely not that year. So human behavior changes were also noted in that year. If you remember 2020, 2021, don't ponder on those years for too long if it's not good for you. But those were the COVID years where people were isolating, people were allowed to go out and walk. And so people did, and in fact, there's some interesting studies looking at higher West Nile infection in younger neighborhoods where the demographic, the actual age is, the average age is lower, because the thought is that those neighborhoods had people that went out and walked around. If they couldn't go to the gym, or go to work and do their usual things, they were going to walk around the neighborhoods, and they were doing it probably during dusk or early morning when those mosquitoes were biting. So human behavior really can impact disease incidence. So this is just to say slightly lower temperatures are good for this mosquito, and the wetter weather conditions for 2021 probably had most of those effects, but also human behavior too. So people get very motivated, and you may be aware of this yourselves if you interact with the general public on mosquito issues in your state. People will take it into their own hands, and they'll start putting stuff down the storm drain system. They'll start trying to trap mosquitoes in box traps and things, which was pretty ingenious, and some interesting videos cropped up online. People will start eating vast amounts of garlic and all manner of other things in an attempt to avoid mosquitoes. So urban sprawl has more effect on other creatures as well. Those synanthropic creatures that like living around us, with us, they will do very, very well the more we build our towns and cities without taking those things and those populations into consideration. And this can cause increases in native species and also non-native species. But I want to give you some examples of native species first. You might be shocked to realize that scorpions, although you may think of them as a desert environment, all of our states, everywhere you're at on this webinar, you will have scorpions of some kind. In Arizona, we have some pretty nasty, medically significant scorpions, and Phoenix and Tucson have some of the highest sting incidents of within the US. Populations of bark scorpions are far higher in city environments than desert environments, because in cities they have access to a much greater amount of their most significant limiting factor. And in the desert, it's water. So they also love, that's a scorpion in my dishwasher, have no good explanation for that. But you can see from the heat map right there, bark scorpions, the heat map for these scorpions, they're in the two big metro areas in the low desert of Arizona. They love these hollow block walls that you can see the picture. That is just like a massive condo complex for bark scorpions. And everybody likes to use those kinds of walls around their apartment complexes and homes and schools. So this is a worldwide phenomenon when we get to cities being invaded by some specific species that just do incredibly well inside city limits, and some of the medical impacts are quite significant. So this is just an example of Brazilian cities that have been invaded by yellow scorpions, which are even way nastier than our bark scorpions. And they've seen changes in where they find them geographically, and some of the behavioral characteristics of the scorpions. They're far more aggressive and tend to sting far more readily. All bad. Even another example of a native species that is higher in incidence in cities is the western widow spider. And again, probably because there's more abundant food and water, and they probably do less well out in desert environments. Okay, invasive species. There are certain invasive species that do phenomenally well in cities, far better than out in rural or areas. So the brown widow, if you don't have them in your state now, please be on the lookout, because you might at some point. And in the West, Arizona, California, and Texas all have, and New Mexico have the brown widows in various pockets. They do very, very well around the built environment. And it's those environments that allow that invasive species to have done so well, where it was introduced in Florida and everywhere else it's gone. Not just insects and arachnids, also rodents have various kinds have expanded ranges. You can see a very, very handsome chap right there. Roof rat populations have expanded within Arizona and other surrounding states as well. So this is the yellow fever mosquito Aedes aegypti, which is a dengue vector and non-native species for us, found in many states in the West, and very common in parts of California and Arizona. And in fact, we did have this last year, the first in-state transmission of the dengue virus being vectored by mosquitoes in-state in the Phoenix metro area. So we were thinking it would crop up along the border because it's endemic, dengue is endemic in south of the US-Mexican border in Sonora, Mexico, but no, it popped up first, hospitalizing somebody in the Phoenix metro area. We have very high populations. We have a very susceptible population of humans, And dengue, the dengue virus, is a human virus. So COVID-19 certainly amplified other health risks directly and indirectly. As far as vector-borne diseases are concerned, an awful lot of environmental health professionals got pulled off the front lines of vector surveillance and started working in, we're doing everything from COVID surveillance to swabbing noses and everything else. I even had to go myself. So everybody who could sort of moved and pivoted to doing those sort of jobs for a while, leaving some of the other work largely undone for a year or two. But let's talk about vector management. Starts with surveillance and evaluation. Surveillance, what is out there and what is it carrying, are the two big questions. And you know, is this a problem? Is this a nuisance mosquito that's biting, or is this a pathogen vector? And the evaluation is critically important, because if you're implementing control measures, you have to know if they're working or not. And some of them will work for a while and then not work anymore. So then source reduction, finding out where the development sites are and doing anything you can to mitigate those. The use of pesticides and biocontrol agents, of course. Public education, of course, hugely important. And you can, anytime you can get the public to report on biting incidents, and also reducing those conditions supportive of mosquito development, all the better. IPM, you know, begins with surveillance. Surveillance happens in many different ways. All of these are important. So human and animal disease tracking, complaint-based reporting, is important. Just having people call in saying there's tons of mosquitoes. Water source reporting, larval and pupal monitoring. So actual trained individuals going out and scooping to see if there's mosquitoes developing in sites, and adult trapping. You don't have to do surveillance using your feet unless you particularly want to. And I would never do that. So knowing what species you have then gives you a clue as to what the key habitats are going to be for your area, and for different mosquitoes it'll be different. And then getting people out into the field to take a look at what's going on. Lots and lots of traps available. They all trap different kinds of mosquitoes, and mosquitoes that are different stage and doing different things. There are mosquitoes traps that surveil for mosquitoes that are looking to lay eggs. There are traps that are specifically trying to catch mosquitoes that are looking for a blood meal. Lots of different traps out there. They all have advantages and disadvantages. So knowing what you have and then getting up to speed on what you need to deploy in the field that will be most useful is great. Some of the traps are also orticidal devices. This is one of the traps that is particularly good at trapping Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito. It's one that I was using outside my house. Once you've got a surveillance program up and running, what do you do next? You know, you have to have equipment and people who will process these samples in the lab and be able to identify them. And then, of course, you need to have an educational group of people who are doing outreach constantly. And then you need to know what pathogens those mosquitoes are carrying or not carrying. A plan is always a fantastically good idea. Trapping equipment and getting lab or getting a contract to have a lab to do the pathogen screening is essential. And there's high-tech and not so high-tech approaches that can be field deployed. So there's many different ways of screening for pathogens. For most arboviruses, pretty much anybody can do it. So the mosquito life cycle, every stage in this life cycle has an opportunity to kill them, whether they're mating, or whether they're just emerging as adults and going looking for sugar meals. There are toxic sugar solutions that are toxic sugar baits that are used to control adults. There are transgenic and sterile release mosquitoes, which may or may not be available in the coming years, depending on what you have going in your state. Some states have opted in, some have not. But that technology is safe, incredibly effective, but very specific to certain species at this time. Maybe that will change. There are, and this is just more about the various options for lethal gene, the deployment of lethal genes as a control mechanism. I'm hoping that it becomes more availably, more acceptable, more broadly in areas that need it, because it's safer and more effective. Source reduction, of course, is critically important, lots of places, but it is overwhelming, completely overwhelming. And so we have to be realistic in what we can expect. And then there are traps that will attract mosquitoes. They will not support the generation of larvae. And those mosquitoes that visit traps pick up a product and that they then disseminate around to other different areas and leave in the water reservoirs, and that prevents eggs from developing to adults. So I'm whizzing through this, I know. If anybody would like a copy of these slides, my email address is on the final slide. But all of these different larval control methods are useful in different situations and different environments. There's a lot. This is just an example, a small list of what is actually out there. And different things are used, obviously, for larvae and for adult controls. Once you are controlling adults, you've kind of lost. In largely, obviously, it's terribly necessary if traps are tested and pathogens are found. So mosquitoes on the wing are actively vectoring viruses. Then adulticiding is terribly important. But by far the ideal situation is to delay or prevent that from happening as much as it's practical to do so. Encouraging people, there's a wide range of repellents at this point. And so if people have sensitivities to DEET or some of them, then there are lots for people to try. And I always encourage people to try different things. Don't give up if they don't like one repellent or can't use one repellent. The overwintering stages, we do the least really during the winter months, and I think probably we should be more aggressively seeking locations where mosquitoes are while they're not feeding, and more aggressively remediating those areas where we can. So urban life's heating up in many areas. Key risk factors for vector-borne diseases include geographical locations, local population demographics, so as we've discussed, municipality planning, and the vector management programs that are in place. So all of those. And just a reminder, anytime you do anything to mitigate or make an area more livable because of climate change effects, we constantly should be considering what those effects are on all the key vectors and key public health pests in the area. so that we can anticipate other needs or whether there's better ways of doing things. Tree canopy, for example, is a better way at creating a cool corridor in an area like the Phoenix metro area than putting waters, fountains, artificial rivers in neighborhoods. So pest prevention by design can be done in any building, and we have some fantastic resources on walking you through how to do that incredibly well. And there's one of the best ones right there for you. For buildings, we need more help when it comes to city planning. We need to be getting entomologists and environmental health professionals involved at the city planning stage rather than after the effect, when a problem has been generated for us to manage. So every action aimed at climate adaptation or mitigation must consider impacts from a One Health perspective. That means taking into account the environment, the animals, the people, the plants, absolutely everything within that whole ecosystem within the built environment. And finally, if none of that convinces you, then and quality of life is not a concern or health, what about the value of your home? Because I can tell you that vector prevalence and having really high levels of pests that impact public health will impact the value of your real estate. Although that's a secondary reason to care, in my opinion, as a public health entomologist. So all forms of public health, this is a famous quote within public health. Public health is local, and similarly, local information is required to increase awareness among residents and policymakers alike of the unique challenges facing communities, and every community is unique. We have, it's interesting, 8 billion people on the planet now. So although we feel like we're heading into the closing stages of a pandemic, rest assured we will have similar challenges in the future. And so it's best to be prepared for them.